This was not just another political moment. It felt bigger than that. The room was calm, but the message was aggressive. Trump talked about Canada like it was surviving on American generosity, stealing American money, blocking American business, and bringing danger across the border. It sounded simple. It sounded dramatic. It sounded made to stick. But the deeper people looked, the less it held up. And that is what made this moment powerful. The gap between the claims and the facts was too big to ignore. The first claim was the one Trump repeated the most. He said America subsidizes Canada by around $200 billion a year. That number was meant to land like a punch. It made Canada sound like a giant burden. It made the U.S. sound like a victim. But official U.S. trade data showed something very different. In 2024, the U.S. goods and services trade deficit with Canada was about $36 billion. Even if you count only goods and ignore services, it was about $71 billion. That is still nowhere near $200 billion. And even that does not mean America is subsidizing Canada. A trade deficit is not a subsidy. It simply means people in one country bought more from the other country than they sold back. That difference matters more than it may seem. A subsidy sounds like a gift. A trade deficit is trade. It is buying and selling. It is supply and demand. It is not one country handing cash to another out of pity. And a big reason for that trade gap is energy. The U.S. buys a lot of Canadian oil, gas, and electricity. That is not charity. That is business that helps power American homes, industries, and cars. So the biggest number Trump used was not just inflated. It changed the meaning of the whole relationship. And once that first claim weakens, the next one gets even harder to believe. Trump also said the U.S. does not do much business with Canada. He made Canada sound like a small player that barely matters to the American economy. But U.S. government data showed Canada was the top destination for U.S. exports in 2024. Canada bought about $440 billion in American goods and services that year. That is not a side market. That is one of the most important customers America has. Think about what that really means. This is not just a story about presidents and prime ministers. It is about factories, farms, truck drivers, rail workers, warehouse staff, and store shelves. It is about parts moving across borders, energy moving into refineries, food moving into markets, and businesses on both sides depending on each other every day. Canada was not some tiny player asking for special treatment. It was one of the biggest buyers of American products in the world. So, when Trump tried to shrink Canada's role, the numbers pushed back hard. If that surprised you, the farm story gets even more revealing. Trump also claimed Canada does not really take American agricultural products. He suggested it buys very little and shuts American farmers out. That story falls apart the same way. U.S. agriculture data showed Canada was one of the biggest customers for American farm goods. In 2024, Canada accounted for around 16.7% of U.S. agricultural exports. That is close to $29 billion. Canada was also one of the top agricultural trade partners of the United States overall. That means American fruit goes there, American vegetables go there, American meat goes there, American ethanol goes there, American food products go there in huge volumes. This is not some tiny flow. It is a major trade relationship. And there is another detail that changes the picture even more. Under the current trade system, almost all agricultural products traded between the U.S. and Canada move tariff-free and quota-free. So the daily reality is not a wall of punishment. The daily reality is heavy normal trade between two deeply connected economies. But then comes the dairy claim, and this is where the story gets more slippery. Trump kept talking about Canada hitting U.S. dairy with tariffs of 250 or 300%, as if American dairy producers face those giant charges all the time. That is not the full picture. Those high tariff rates do exist for some products, but only after U.S. exports go over certain quota limits. Below those limits, American dairy goes into Canada with zero tariffs. And U.S. producers have not been coming close to filling those quotas. That changes everything. A rate on paper is not the same as the normal rate in practice. If exports stay below the quota, those giant tariffs do not kick in. So, the way Trump described the dairy issue made it sound like American farmers were constantly slammed by extreme tariffs, when the actual system is far more limited and far more specific. And there is one more twist. The trade deal behind this system came from the USMCA, the agreement negotiated during Trump's own first term. So, the idea that this was some brand new scheme built by someone else simply does not hold up. That does not mean the dairy dispute is fake. It is real. Canada does protect its dairy sector more than the U.S. wants, but that is not the same as saying American dairy is being crushed every day by giant tariffs. The real story is narrower, more technical, and much less dramatic than the version that was being sold to the public. And by now, a pattern starts to appear. The claim begins with something real, then it gets stretched, sharpened, and simplified until it becomes something much bigger than the facts support. And that same pattern showed up again with banking. Trump said Canada does not allow American banks to open or do business there. That claim was simply false. U.S. banks do operate in Canada. Canada has a tightly regulated banking system, so getting in is not effortless, but regulation is not a ban. In fact, there are multiple US-based bank branches and subsidiaries operating in Canada with large amounts of assets. Big American names already do business there. The difference between regulated and banned is huge, but banned sounds stronger. Banned creates anger. Banned turns a policy issue into an outrage story. That is what makes these claims so effective at first. They take something complex and make it feel personal and unfair. And that matters because most people do not stop their day to read trade agreements or banking rules. They hear a sharp line and the sharp line stays in their head. But the story kept breaking the moment real data showed up. Trump also described Canada as if it contributes almost nothing to defense. He said Canada spends less than 1% of its GDP on the military and made it sound like it hardly carries any weight at all. Official NATO estimates showed Canada was at about 1.37% in 2024. That is below NATO's 2% target, and that part is a fair criticism. Canada has faced pressure for years to spend more, but below target is not the same as below 1%. Those are different claims, and that difference matters. It matters even more because Canada is not some country with no military role. Canada has tens of thousands of regular service members and tens of thousands more reservists. It works with the U.S. through NORAD, the joint command that helps defend North American airspace. That is not symbolic. That is real. The two countries share responsibility, territory, warning systems, and strategic interests. So, when Trump made it sound like the U.S. protects Canada for free while Canada contributes almost nothing, that ignored how the relationship actually works. And there is another point people miss. Canada may be under target as a share of GDP, but in raw dollars, it is still one of the larger defense spenders in NATO because it is a major economy. So again, the criticism started with a real issue and then got pushed beyond the truth. That is what keeps happening in this story. Not every concern is invented from nothing, but the message people receive is stronger, simpler, and harsher than the facts allow. Then came the claim that hit one of the deepest fears in America. Trump kept linking Canada to fentanyl as if the northern border were a major pipeline feeding the U.S. drug crisis. That is the kind of line that can change public opinion very fast because fentanyl is not an abstract topic. It is deadly. It has devastated families, communities, and entire towns. That is exactly why this claim had to be checked carefully. When it was checked, the numbers told a very different story. U.S. border data showed that in fiscal year 2024, authorities seized about 21,189 pounds of fentanyl across U.S. borders. Of that amount, just 43 pounds were seized at the Canadian border. That is about 0.2%. More than 21,000 pounds were seized at the Mexican border. Even later reporting that showed some increase at the northern border still found Canada's share remained tiny compared with the south. That does not mean nothing crosses from Canada. Some does. But there is a huge difference between some and a massive flow. There is a huge difference between a small problem and the main source. That difference matters when leaders use a threat to justify tariffs, pressure, or public anger. If people are told a danger is huge, they may support responses they would never support if they knew the scale was actually small. And that brings the whole picture into focus. One claim says America is handing Canada $200 billion. Another says Canada barely matters to U.S. business. Another says Canada hardly buys U.S. farm goods. Another says giant dairy tariffs are crushing American producers every day. Another says U.S. banks are blocked. Another says Canada barely spends on defense. Another says Canada is a major fentanyl threat. Put them together and they create one emotional story. Canada looks like a dishonest, weak, ungrateful country living off the U.S. while causing damage in return. But one by one, the details break down. The subsidy claim does not match the trade data. The business claim does not match U.S. export records. The farm claim does not match agriculture data. The dairy claim leaves out how quotas work. The bank claim ignores existing U.S. operations in Canada. The defense claim bends NATO numbers. The fentanyl claim ignores the tiny share linked to the Canadian border. When you line them up like that, the pattern becomes hard to miss. And that is why Mark Carney's response mattered so much. The strongest thing about it was not emotion. It was not volume. It was not outrage. It was restraint. He pushed back with facts that came from the American side. That made it much harder to dismiss. It was not just Canada saying, trust us. It was Canada saying, look at the U.S. data, look at the U.S. Trade Office, look at the U.S. farm numbers, look at the U.S. border statistics. That changes the balance in the room. The deeper meaning of this moment goes beyond one meeting. It shows how modern political messaging often works. A leader finds a real point of tension, strips away the detail, inflates the scale, and turns complexity into a villain story. That story travels fast because it is simple. It creates anger, and anger is easy to move. But once anger gets attached to something false or exaggerated, policy can start moving in the wrong direction too. And ordinary people pay for that. Workers pay when trade fights damage factories and supply chains. Farmers pay when retaliation closes markets. Families pay when prices rise. Drivers pay when energy becomes more expensive or unstable. Businesses pay when trust between close partners starts to break. So this was not some isolated clash of personalities. It was a fight over how reality gets described, and that affects how real people live. There was also a deeper symbolic layer to all of this. Trump has often talked about Canada as if it were something that could be absorbed, pushed around, or pressured into a smaller role. Carney's pushback was not just about tariffs or trade balances. It was about the right of a country to refuse a false story about itself. That matters because once a country is reduced to a cartoon, it becomes easier to justify punishing it. And if that can happen to a close ally, it can happen to anyone. That is why this moment stuck with so many people. It was not just another loud exchange. It was a reminder that repetition can make weak claims sound strong. It was a reminder that fear can make tiny numbers feel huge. It was a reminder that complexity can be erased in a few seconds if nobody bothers to check the record. And it was also a reminder that facts still matter when someone is willing to use them clearly and calmly. By the end, the strongest image was not the one many expected. It was not raw political force. It was not dominance. It was not intimidation. It was a much simpler thing. It was the sight of a big narrative getting smaller every time real numbers entered the conversation. That is what made the fact-checking hit so hard. It did not need shouting. The gap between the claims and the data did the work on its own. In the end, this was about more than Canada. It was about what happens when public debate stops caring whether a line is true as long as it sounds strong. It was about how easy it is to build support for hard policies using fear, resentment, and inflated numbers. And it was about the rare power of someone slowing the whole thing down and forcing the facts back into the room. That is why this moment matters. 7 claims created one dramatic story. But when those claims met U.S. data, the story did not survive in the same form. It shrank. It cracked. It lost its force. And what remained was a clear lesson that still feels important now. Loud claims can dominate a room for a moment, but numbers have a way of staying standing after the noise is gone.